Well, there is no doubt we spent a lot of time in segments past talking about the robocalls issue. I'm pretty sure we called it a scandal more than a few times. Others suggested it might be the biggest conspiracy to impact an election ever. Sure didn't sound like that today when Elections Canada, after a 3-year investigation, concluded not a lot of there, at least that they could find. Andrew's away this week. Chantal is here in Toronto. Bruce is in Ottawa, and so is Althea Raj, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Huffington Post. Let's start with you, Bruce. What do we make of this today?
Well, it was a good news day for the Conservatives, Peter. Another good news day, although it says something about the state of events in Ottawa, where a run of good news is a series of stories about not being charged. But I think that there's really lessons for everybody in this. I think for the Conservatives, there's probably a lesson to be learned about how to put an issue like this away more efficiently. Their general approach to criticisms or accusations is to respond with something that sounds vaguely like your mother wears army boots, and things get escalated very quickly after that, and these issues don't get solved very quickly. I think for everybody else, though, including the partisan opponents of the government, there's a real lesson here about not making mountains out of what may just be molehills. Where there's smoke, sometimes there's fire, but there isn't for sure arson. I think prudence and caution in how we handle information going forward is something that everybody needs to take a hard look at and make sure that in the drive to make a sharp accusation, fill a short media cycle, that people don't step outside the bounds of what facts are available. All
right. We'll get back to some of that in a minute. Chantal, your view on this?
I think that the first message is it restores the principle of the benefit of the doubt. If you believe that people are in public life for good reasons, then you should afford them some measure of benefit of the doubt. The other lesson, I think, is for people who lead coalitions online. You can mobilize people, but in an issue like that, what did they find? That 40,000 people wrote in to say that they thought they'd been victim of some ploy, and then hundreds were found to have maybe some basis for this. So it doesn't really work to blow up the numbers just to say, oh my God, all these Canadians were robbed of their votes, when it turns out that you cannot come up with verification for 90% of them.
Okay, well, that's part of the issue today, about not being able to come up with verification, and why they weren't able to come up with verification, because they claim to not really have the powers to do that. Althea, what do you make of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't a complete vindication, although it was a good news day for the government, but it essentially just said, we don't have the powers and we couldn't complete our investigation. We didn't have enough evidence to actually find out what actually happened. And so there wasn't, a clear pattern, and it seems a bit scattered around the country, but we weren't able to find out because we didn't have the powers either to compel witnesses or to follow the paper trail. We couldn't compel financial documents. We couldn't get phone numbers. We couldn't get audio recordings to actually check to see what people were complaining about was actually happening.
Yeah, but let's be fair here. 40,000 people said they'd had issues. They checked every one of them and found 100 and something or 200 of them might have grounds for this. And it's not just the powers issue. Then they got a former Supreme Court justice. I'm not saying it's all right, but still, to look at all this. And Louise Charon, who came to the conclusion that knowing all of the hurdles that stood in the way of Elections Canada to get to the truth, she still believed that the outcome would have been the same. And those numbers do suggest that. And I know that it's unpleasant to talk about the good news story when it's more interesting to talk about scandals, but the numbers on this are pretty convincing. The complaints went up when the number of news stories multiplied by hundreds. And what the Elections Canada inquiry shows is that people answered that they thought they had an issue but couldn't back it up, and it wasn't clear whether they suddenly thought they had an issue because of the coverage rather than because of reality. So at the end of the day, I think we should pause long and hard and look at this, and every party should, because if they one day are in power, they will be at the end of this, and ponder what this means to them. And I don't think it's just the limits of power of the Elections Canada Commission.
I think you're not, I think all of us are not just talking about political parties here. We're talking about the media as well here, right? I mean, yes. You keep saying that
Absolutely.
It's the media that in many ways escalated this story, but which is part of their job to push on stories, to try to investigate. But, you know, what responsibility is borne here by the media in all this, Bruce?
Well, I do think that the media had a responsibility to kind of provoke further inquiry, deeper inquiry. But I think it's now the responsibility of the media to take a look at the available evidence, and notwithstanding what was said about maybe they should have more powers to compel testimony, the evidence really suggests at best or at worst, depending on how you look at it, something bad was done, probably just in one riding, but it doesn't really amount to anything even close to the kind of allegations of broad subterfuge that were going on. And the media, I think, have a responsibility when the facts come out this way to acknowledge that there needs to be a bit more caution sometimes in how some of these stories are prosecuted.
You know, Althea, you still look like you have a but in your sentence on covering this story.
Yeah, well, I think that I thought it was quite unfair, actually, for the commissioner to suggest that the media had blown this out of proportion, and it was because of the media that all these, you know, erroneous people called in. The fact is, a lot of people probably received a call during the election and thought, oh, it's just an error, and then thought nothing again about it until these allegations emerged in the media. And then they called and said...
But we don't have evidence of that.
No, we don't.
No, but what we do know, for example, so you get a call on your cell phone and it's somebody offering you a cruise to go somewhere. Do you complain about that? No, who complains about that? There was only 1% of the voters in Guelph, and that is with local media telling you that there were problems during, you know, at the voting station in Guelph. Only 1% of people who received calls complained. So I think I don't know that we can actually look at the numbers and say, well, not enough people complained, and therefore, you know, it was less than we actually thought it was. What is clear is that, you know, things like Lead On, I think, was one of the groups that, you know, had an organized campaign. They kind of perhaps distracted from people who, you know, actually had calls. But maybe Elections Canada should have told people about this after the election occurred and not waited, you know, and not used the calls that were 9 months old after they emerged in the media. So people would have had a fresher recollection of what had happened.
All right, just two things. Chantal wants in on this, I know, but we should keep making the point that the Guelph investigation
is set aside.
Is set aside, and they haven't, you know, determined exactly what happened there. And there are, you know, there's still charges to be heard later this year in the summer that it's related to robocalls as well. So there are still other things coming up. Chantal?
But we are a long way from a stolen election.
Right.
And I think it would not be good journalism to not acknowledge that, for one thing. The other thing is, while for the LeadNow.ca is not just a group, they were responsible for the bulk of the people who suddenly thought that they had issues. And people will have issues with robocall. So I'm not saying that this was misguided. But at the end of the day, when you looked at the pattern back then, for a conspiracy, they were strange conspirators. There were, you know, this conspiracy to have vote outcomes in ridings where, for instance, the Conservatives were not even players. A riding in Quebec that was of relatively little importance to any party. So at the end of the day, we also are responsible for putting forward the other side of the argument. Rather than saying this was a robbed election. And I don't think the facts sustain the notion that this was a robbed election.
All right.
I'm not saying
one
that
thing,
either.
yeah, just a sec. One thing about robocalls is it led in many ways to the other discussion that we've been having frequently here, which is the Fair Elections Act, and the pounding the government has been taking on it. Interesting today that Pierre Poilievre, the minister responsible for this act, had this to say in terms of there's been a lot of suggestion that they've got to listen to amendments. Here's what he said.
And we are open to improvements to this bill, and very soon the government will make clear which amendments it will support. But let me be clear on this point. The Fair Elections Act, in its final form, will require every single voter produce ID showing who they are before they vote.
All right, I want to talk about this, but just to remind everybody, we've only got a couple of minutes to talk about it. So let's start with the president of the Pierre Poilievre fan club, Bruce Anderson.
Well, this has been one of the most poorly handled pieces of legislation that I can recall from this government. It's a period of time when the government should have strategically been trying to talk about free trade, or a fiscal balance, but instead they spent endless hours, days, weeks talking about the problem, the widespread problem of voter fraud, which almost nobody believes exists, and they continue to emphasize the idea that this is the solution that's needed. When you look at the language, set aside the appointment of Mr. Poilievre to lead this, which was strategically really quite odd, but the language that's being used, we need longer arms and sharper teeth. I ask myself sometimes, who writes this stuff? What is it that makes them feel that voters are out there saying that's what we need? A Pierre Poilievre with longer arms and sharper teeth to intervene in these fraudulent elections. So no, this has been a terrible piece of legislation. They'll probably accept some amendments. I think how many of what nature those amendments that are accepted are will determine whether the opposition parties continue with their basic position, which is elect us and we'll tear it up, or whether they try to find some common ground.
Althea?
Well, I want to just, make the link between the Robocall report that we had today and the Fair Elections Act, which is going to be possibly amended next week. A lot of the things that the commissioner said in this report said, we couldn't get to the bottom of it because a lot of these powers are missing. And all those powers that he identified in this report are still missing from this bill. And you have to wonder, why are they not in there? And it's much more than vouching. It's about, not allowing the telephone companies to keep records of the phone numbers they called. How are we supposed to follow the money and follow the paper trail if you don't force people to disclose documents?
Chantal?
On that point, I would question whether any party is really pushing to have robocalls more closely monitored, because today's report showed that every party told Elections Canada that they really needed robocalls. They felt they were a great thing for them. Second, to Poilievre's speech, I'm not aware that in this country we have been voting without showing ID. So that sounds like an empty sentence. And third, this bill, like all election reform bill, needs some degree of political consensus. And if you can't get the opposition on side with at least some amendments, it makes it a politically flawed bill, which will or will not be changed, but politically a bad operation.
All right. Quickly, once around, one-word answers. Was this the beginning of a real retreat, or was it just words? Chantal?
Well, retreats, in the case of this government, have been either very radical or non-existent, so I don't really know.
All right, that was more than one word. Bruce, yes or no?
Words.
Words only. Althea?
No.
All right. And leave it at that. See what happens when the retreat, if there is one, starts. One thing we should mention, we forgot to mention, is it's Chantal's birthday today.
Happy birthday.
That's
Happy
right.
birthday.
Oh, thank you.
All right.